Nice meeting you. I'm going to go dark while it starts recording.
And I'll just give it a minute for folks to file in and make my announcements, and then I'll hand it over to Julie.
Sounds good.
See, Deborah, now we're already at 130, so.
Yeah, it's just they're flooding in.
Not just the 6 of us.
I'd have been much more cozy with just the 6 of us.
Yeah, for sure.
I know.
Okay, so I'm going to start making a couple of announcements for folks. So greetings, everyone. My name is Rachel Hasna, and I am with UNM's Division for Community Behavioral Health. Welcome to our law and mental health didactic. Just a quick things about our CEU process. In the last 5 minutes of the lecture, we will submit a link into the chat. If you're having a difficulty locating your chat, you just want to toggle your mouse over your screen. At the bottom of the screen, there should be an icon for a chat. You click that, it'll pull up your chat. And so the link is there. You can click it or copy and paste it into your browser, fill out the evaluation, and a certificate is automatically generated for you. It's your responsibility to save it. So if you're on your smartphone, you'll want to take a screenshot. And if you're on your computer, just save it as a Word doc or a PDF. If you're joining us by phone, you can always email us and I will happily send you the link. We will be, towards the end of this week, sending out to everybody a copy of the slides as well as the recording link. And I just wanted to mention, because we have had some issues with emails. So if you're sending me emails and you're not getting a response from me, I'm most certainly not ignoring you. UNM has a firewall, and then if you're emailing from your agency, likely your agency has a firewall as well. So when I'm responding to folks, sometimes they get kicked back. I would try just sending me an email using a personal or some alternative email, and I would be happy to get whatever information you need. So I'll hand it over to Julie now.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome everybody to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're glad to have you join us here today. My name is Julie Brovko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. First, I want to remind you to join us next week. At that time, Caitlin McLaughlin will be presenting Understanding the Relevance of Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder in Criminal Justice and Forensic Settings. Now, for our talk today, please ask your questions in the Q&A anytime you feel comfortable. Just know we're probably not going to get to them until the end. Also, we always try our best to get to as many of your questions as possible, so please forgive us if we can't get to yours. For those of you who want your CEUs, but you're on a tight schedule, know that you do need to stay for the full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. So I'll try to let you know when that hour has passed, but we will likely be staying on longer to address your questions. So now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Debra Baeder. Dr. Baeder is board certified in forensic psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology. She's the Chief Forensic Psychologist for the State Forensic Services in Maine and the Clinical Director of the Office of Behavioral Health for the Department of Health and Human Services. Her responsibilities are the evaluations of adult defendants on issues of competence and criminal responsibility, pre-sentence evaluations, and evaluations of insanity acquittees who petition the court. She also coordinates the Juvenile Evaluation Program for the State Forensic Service. In that capacity, she conducts pre-adjudicatory, pre-dispositional, adjudicative competence, and bindover evaluations. She consults with and trains other examiners contracted with the State Forensic Service and trains psychiatric residents at the Maine Medical Center. She also manages the statewide intensive care management program and consults with mental health court dockets on policy and legislative issues and on complex cases intersecting mental health and criminal justice. Dr. Baeder also provides workshops on juvenile forensic topics in Maine and nationally. Dr. Baeder, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and New Mexico's Behavioral Health Services Division, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for presenting today. We're so grateful for your time and expertise, and I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First order of business, I got to shorten that biography. I apologize, Julie, for making you read that whole thing. That's ridiculous. But anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here. I feel like I'm in very august company. So thank you all for coming. Our topic for today, I'll just go back a slide, just so you know. I just love this slide, I have to say. That's why I left it there, because it just so encapsulates adolescence, that sort of imaginary audience aspect of adolescence, that I thought it was hysterical. Let's see if I can get these to go back here. Oh dear. Oh, I'm not getting any movement on my slides here. What is the deal? Well, that's not going to be good. Oh, there we go. All right, see if I can go backward. There we go. The topic of today is developmental considerations in juvenile forensic evaluations. I mean, I think this seems like it should be quite intuitive that, of course, if you're doing juvenile forensic evaluations, that you need to know about adolescent development. But even though it's intuitive, I think it's a fairly nuanced subject matter. So I want to get into it today. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going over key areas that we all assess for when we do juvenile forensic evaluations, things like cognition, cognitive capabilities, psychopathology, risk factors, amenability, and then of course, finally, interventions. And the material that I'm going to be presenting is going to be grounded in research on adolescent development, because it really permeates every kind of evaluation that we do, whether it's juvenile competence to proceed or just the kind of broad-based dispositional evaluations, transfer, waiver, we call them bindover in Maine, but transfer or waiver evaluations, risk assessments. So it permeates everything. So to start, we're going to start about talking about cognition. And as you guys know, healthy adolescents, as they approach the age of roughly 16, they have about as much cognitive competence as do adults. So what happens is that they tend to move from early adolescence, from very concrete thinking, to more abstract thinking in later adolescence. And ultimately, what we're looking for as adolescents proceed and get an age through the adolescent period is improved abilities to reason effectively, to problem solve, to be able to reflect on their decisions, and to plan for the future. But the younger the adolescent is, the more difficulty he or she will have with those capabilities. So as I said, they tend to move from concrete to abstract. And what do we mean by abstract thinking? But before I go into that, I want you to consider a scenario. And here's the scenario. Let's say there's a juvenile that's sitting in detention, and the juvenile's offered a plea deal that would allow, I'm going to say him just for the sake of argument, a plea deal that would allow him to leave detention on conditions of release. And those conditions will include a curfew, abstinence from substances, attendance at school, staying away from antisocial peers, those kinds of things. So I want you to keep that scenario in your mind as we consider the ways that development impacts on a youth's ability to kind of tease out the essential things that will require them to make a good decision under those circumstances. So when we talk about abstract reasoning, we can break it down into several component parts. One is, can the juvenile consider hypotheticals? And what I mean by hypotheticals is, can they consider aspects of a decision about which they've had no direct experience? So they have to kind of imagine and think hypothetically. Can he imagine experiences that he might encounter that it would make adhering to conditions of release, for example, difficult? So going back to our scenario, can the juvenile think, if they've never been in detention before, they've never been subjected to conditions of release, Can they imagine a scenario or elements of that decision-making that would make adherence to those conditions difficult? Can he consider multiple aspects of the problem? For example, with respect to that scenario, do I stay in detention, serve my time, and get out without any conditions? Or do I want to get out now and have conditions of release that might be difficult for me to conform to? Can I weigh and juggle those multiple aspects? Another aspect of abstract thinking is perspective taking. With respect to our scenario, what would my parents think? What will my friends expect of me if I get out on conditions of release? So can I take another person's perspective? Can I think about cause and effect? If I violate those conditions, what will happen? Cause and effect. Can they think in symbols, or can they use symbols and metaphors to kind of improve their decision making? For example, the scenario about getting out on conditions of release might be akin to, saving up for something bigger down the line versus spending my money now, saving for the future versus spending my money now. That's a metaphor or a symbolic representation of the problem. And can they think about the parts of the problem versus the whole? What will happen, for example, to my juvenile record if I violate my conditions? So that's kind of a parts to the whole kind of way of thinking about it. So we want them to be able to gradually over time, what we expect to see is that we expect to see juveniles using more sophisticated information processing approaches to deal with problems that they are facing. And in the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system, we want to see more sophisticated information processing in terms of their ability to work with their attorney, their ability to comport with conditions of release, their ability to waive rights. There's a whole host of decisions that they have to make as being part of the juvenile justice system that weigh heavily on their cognitive capabilities. Other things that happen as kids sort of progress through the developmental period is that knowledge increases. It's not just knowing what, just sort of accumulating facts and that kind of knowledge, but it's knowing how. I think about the first person I would ever have when my kids were home, when my teenagers were home, they would be the first people I would talk to about technology. They thought I was a complete Luddite, that I didn't, I was very unsophisticated when it came to technology, but they picked it up really easily. And so that's the thing that really builds steam in as the adolescent period progresses, that tendency to understand how things work. And working memory also increases. Their ability to concentrate, attend to an issue, hold something in short-term memory, to imagine it in their head, their visual spatial skills, to be able to kind of see a picture of it in their head, to talk it through within their head and use multi-step processes. Those really improve over time. I like to think of it as sort of imagine doing a math problem in your head. You have to concentrate on it, hold things in attention, hold things in short-term memory, do some calculations, and it's a very multiple step process. And this comes up in a lot in the kinds of evaluations we do in the juvenile justice system, particularly when it comes to competence. Evaluating plea deals needs working memory. Considering their rights and waiving those rights is another process that has multiple steps that require some working memory. Okay, so not only do those processes improve, but also deductive reasoning improves. And if you think about deductive reasoning, what I mean by that is it's combining premises, different premises, and deriving a logically sound conclusion. Just a very simple example is all fruit have seeds. Apples have seeds, so apples are fruit. So that's taking different premises, combining them to a logically sound conclusion. And, a more apt metaphor with respect to adolescence is rule breaking has consequences. violating my curfew is breaking a rule. And so there are likely to be consequences if I get caught violating my curfew. That is the ability to use, that's an example of an ability to use deductive reasoning. And generally, adolescents are better at that if the content of the material is familiar to them. But as they age, they get better still when the content becomes more abstract or less familiar. So decision-making also improves as adolescents, teenagers progress through the adolescent period. As they get older, they can increasingly distinguish between options that satisfy multiple goals versus options that only satisfy one goal. However, the more emotionally arousing the decision is, and the more likely it is that they're going to be in the presence of their peers, the caliber of decision-making is likely to be worse. In a way to think about this is imagine a juvenile working with an attorney to evaluate a plea deal, which may have an emotionally laden content, but not quite the same way as as a juvenile making a decision about whether to go out and be with their peers and engage in delinquent behavior. Go for a joyride with friends, for example, or something along those lines. So you can see that their caliber of decision-making is going to vary from situation to situation, depending on the structure and supervision that's involved, the emotionally laden content of the decision, the presence of peers. Those are all factors that are going to impede, aggravate, or mitigate their decision-making capabilities. So they're also, as I said, they can get better at evaluating an option that serves multiple goals versus an option that only serves one goal. One goal is I want to get out of detention. I'm going to take any plea deal that anybody offers me. As long as I can get out of here, I want to get out of detention. That's a decision that services one goal. But as adolescents get older, what they're likely to be able to tell you is I know myself. I know I'm likely to violate a condition. And I know that that's going to end up exacerbating my legal issues. So I'm going to kind of reject the plea deal and serve my time and get out free and clear. I've had kids tell me that. And that's usually a decision that is better able to be made by an older adolescent when they can kind of weigh those multiple goals. And generally, adolescents fear potential negative social consequences more than they fear other risks. That's why they're so vulnerable to peer influence, because the notion of negative social consequences from their peer, the fear of that far outweighs any other risk calculation that they may be making with respect to a specific behavior. So they also are, as they get older, are better able to make what they call counterfactual propositions, to consider counterfactual propositions. And what I mean by that is, can they think, okay, this bad thing happened. I got caught doing this bad thing. What if I had done something differently? Would there have been a different outcome? So as they get older, they can imagine how an outcome could have turned out differently if what led to that event were different. So they know they can't change the past, but they can think of, if I had only done something differently. Think about getting in a car accident. If I only hadn't been speeding, I might not have gone off the road. That kind of counterfactual proposition. So what you want, when you're doing an evaluation, what you want to ask yourself is, can they think about how they got into their current circumstance? And what could they have done differently? And then how might things have turned out differently? And that's a fairly sophisticated thought process that tends to get better with age. They tend to get better at those kind of propositions over time. And then moral development tends to track cognitive development. It parallels it. And one way I think about this is when I think about the concept of empathy. In juvenile evaluations, much is made of empathy. Much is, particularly in bindover or waiver evaluations, does the child feel remorse, show remorse, demonstrate remorse? Well, empathy / remorse is a very, very developmental skill. and it tends to change over time. And what kind of things, if you think about it, what kind of skills do you need to have in order to be able to demonstrate empathy? You need to have perspective taking. You need to be able to kind of reason hypothetically. You know, what are the values of rules? What is fairness? Can another person's opinion have as much value as my own? And usually those skills develop over time. So in evaluations, I'm usually pretty careful to talk about the kind of empathy that a person can develop and whether that's age appropriate. For example, a younger adolescent might feel, you know, I'm sorry that I got caught. I'm sorry that I've gotten myself into this bad situation. That's sort of the first level. As they get older, they might begin to feel, I'm sorry I broke the rules. I understand that these are rules and that I broke a rule. And then they might think, I'm sorry my family is going through this. I'm sorry that not only am I sorry that I'm in this, you know, crappy situation or that I broke a rule, but I'm also sorry that my parents are upset, that I've upset my parents. And then the last stage is usually, you know, some sense of empathy for the victim. You know, I'm sorry about the impact of my behavior on the victim. And that is very developmental. So when I talk about empathy, particularly in bindover evaluations, I'm very careful to say what seems to be age appropriate. And is the court asking, if the court is asking for empathy for the victim, and it's not there, I really try to explain whether that is rooted in sort of where the child is developmentally. I hope that makes sense. So in our evaluations, with respect to cognition, some of the questions we want to ask ourselves is what is required of the decisions they have to make? And this is particularly relevant in juvenile competence evaluations. What kind of decisions do they have to make? And how good are they at factoring in the assistance of their attorney in making those decisions? Can the child think hypothetically? How many issues need to be considered simultaneously? For example, you can take a negotiated plea, but you have to cooperate with the investigation, and that cooperation may involve implicating a peer. There's several issues that need to be taken into account at the same time there. And are they developmentally able to do that? Is this a familiar decision? Some kids that you all have seen or that I see have been involved in the juvenile justice system several times. Or is this a very unfamiliar decision? Is this the first time? Is the decision that they have to make, does it challenge very dearly held beliefs? And some of those dearly held beliefs might involve, for example, implicating a peer. I don't want to be a rat. I don't want to implicate my peers. And so that makes those decisions much more challenging. You know, what is the emotional context of the decision? How much anxiety is produced by having to make this decision? I evaluated a very young adolescent who couldn't even review the discovery material because it created with her attorney, because it created so much emotion, so much anxiety. So, you know, you have to kind of think through what is the level of the emotional content that the decision is likely to engender. And then are there additive factors? Are there otherwise cognitive deficits? What's the juvenile's family life like? Is that likely to contribute to good decision-making or bad decision-making? You know, what their friendships, those kinds of additive factors that might also impinge on decision-making. So that's a quick way of taking a look at cognition and how it impacts in various aspects of juvenile forensic evaluations. The research essentially says that there are no significant differences in measures of intelligence, deductive reasoning, or working memory across gender. Males still are more likely to engage in intellectual risk-taking, more likely to throw out something that might be wrong, and take those kind of intellectual risks. And they're still today, although I think this is a very broad generalization, but there is a confidence gap that girls tend to have more confidence in reading and social skills and boys in math and physical activity. Although I hasten to say, I think that's a pretty broad generalization, and there are more probably within group differences than there are in between group differences, or there are as many in all likelihood. And with respect to ethnic differences, there are no differences, again, either in deductive reasoning, decision-making, and working memory. And frankly, whatever differences have appeared with respect to academic achievement, they tend to be reduced when parent education and socioeconomic status are controlled for. So that's just a quick word on that. Okay, so with respect to cognition and forensic evaluations, for competence evaluations, we've kind of gone through this. What are the hypotheticals they have to consider? How emotionally laden is the decision? And can they weigh long-term versus short-term consequences with respect to plea deals and pleas in general and that sort of thing? And in dispositional and waiver evaluations, you've got to look at how cognition factors into risk, amenability, but probably more saliently with respect to interventions. Because if you think about, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in a few minutes, but if you think about cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, there's a very heavy cognitive component to that might be fine for a 16, 17, 18-year-old, but might be difficult without accommodations for a much younger adolescent. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about with respect to the intersection of development is psychopathology and the development of psychopathology. As you know, the experience of psychopathology increases the risk of involvement in the juvenile justice system. So kids that have, and most juveniles involved in the juvenile justice system are multiply diagnosed. So particularly difficult are those kids with co-occurring both internalizing disorders and disruptive behavior disorders. So what we're going to talk about today is how development impacts the initiation of psychopathology, but also the maintenance over time of psychopathology. So with respect to how it's elicited, both context or the environment and biology play a role in the eliciting of psychopathology. So, and in fact, context plays a different role. It's involved in both eliciting and maintaining psychopathology, but it plays a slightly different role in eliciting psychopathology. So for example, context might elicit something like stress, which can result in very different outcomes depending on biological vulnerabilities. All right. In other words, a stressful environment can trigger a number of different responses. For example, if you think about loss is a stressor that can elicit a number of different responses, from depression to aggression, depending on biological vulnerabilities. And if you think about biological makeup, think of it not as a fixed phenomenon, but think of it as sort of genetically inclined predispositions that are malleable in response to different aspects of the environment. All right. So, as I said, context can trigger stress. And if you think about stress, think of it as arousal that is based on an individual's autonomic reactivity. And then psychopathology develops when there are individual problems with the ability to regulate that arousal. So you get an environment, it triggers a stress, it creates a response in our autonomic reaction, I apologize. And then our ability to self-soothe and regulate that arousal is really plays a big role in whether psychopathology then develops. So let's talk about that. Let's break that down. How an individual appraises threat may trigger a reaction that is very subjective. For example, a high conflict environment can trigger stress. But it's the appraisal of that high conflict that determines how acute that stress may be. And if the individual interprets and appraises that threat as catastrophic, then that can lead to problems with regulating that emotion and that stress. And over time, if that high conflict environment becomes chronic, then those responses can become consolidated and can become a pattern over time. So early and repeated exposure to stressful environments coupled with sort of a biological vulnerability to stress that's repeated over time can lead to the maintenance of psychopathology. Okay, on that topic. When it comes to maintaining a course of psychopathology, the consolidation of that pattern is a direct function of the extent to which the environment permits the behavioral responses to happen over and over and over again. So are the stressors chronic? Is the reactivity under-addressed or unaddressed? And if that happens over time, then the psychopathology is more likely to become a chronic situation. Okay. So if you think about aggressive children and who have a lack of structure and supervision in their environment. And so their aggression is unchecked, and then they go to school and they get sort of ostracized or pushed to the margins by their peers, rejected by their peers, and that creates a snowball effect with respect to maintaining that kind of psychopathology. It gets crystallized in a way that is much harder to change. And once it's crystallized, it increases the likelihood that they're going to continue to have these experiences over time. So it's really how the arousal is addressed or not addressed, how chronic the stressors are in the environment or not, that contributes to the maintenance of psychopathology over time. So that we suppose that the initiation and the maintenance of internalizing and externalizing disorders depends both on the environment and on individual predispositions. Okay, so let's look at specific common disorders that occur in adolescence. We'll start with anxiety disorders. The median age of onset for anxiety disorders is around 11 years old. And females have a 1.5 times greater lifetime average of anxiety disorders than do males. And anxiety disorders involve a shaping process in the brain that goes on throughout development. Think about how attributions are made, cause and effect thinking, and it tends to take a fairly episodic route in early development. And most adolescents' anxiety remit as the adolescent reaches the later developmental period. But for kids who continue to show anxiety throughout their adolescence, the risk is high for a chronic course in adulthood. So how does this happen? Think about the social changes that occur in adolescence, peer affiliation, for example. They place a high level of stress on neural networks that are already very vulnerable given their ongoing reorganization and their development in early adolescence. And under conditions of stress, let's say peer rejection, for example, then those neural regions involving, that social information processing are at risk for impairment. Okay. And anxious kids tend to attend to threat-related information pretty highly. So attention to threat-related information is particularly disturbed during high states of anxiety. And the higher the anxiety, the greater attention to threat-related information. And that's particularly true of traumatized kids. Traumatized kids can focus like a laser on the threat that's coming from their environment. And often that threat is generalized to lower level stressors. And so it just becomes a very anxious pattern of behavior that happens over time. Adults can tend to shift away from that threat-related information. They can shift away from very evocative stimuli. They can engage in self-soothing. Think about test anxiety. I remember when I took the EPPP, when I first got my license in psychology, I have a bit of test anxiety. And so, I engaged in some self-talk, some self-soothing. I shifted my attention away from that anxiety, one question at a time, one page at a time. And that's the kind of self-soothing techniques that adults can use that help them to shift away from stimuli with their highly emotional content. Adolescents have a tougher time with that. And adolescents, both with anxiety or at high risk of anxiety, respond differently, depending on whether they're coached to direct their attention away from highly evocative stimuli, which suggests that interventions can really work to reduce anxiety for kids. So, teaching kids to direct their attention away from emotional threats, does result in mood states that are that have less anxiety. Think of it kind of like inoculation training. And we're going to talk more about interventions in a second. Okay, so depressive disorders. Depression also surges in adolescence. There's a female preponderance that emerges by the age of 13 or 14. And by 18, there's about a 2-to-1 ratio of greater female depression. Although they found that those gender differences are much weaker in African American and Latino populations. And I wrote the irony of cognitive development. The more cognitive development proceeds, the more vulnerable kids can become to depression. If you think about as cause and effect thinking and selective attention and future orientation and hypothetical reasoning improve, they're improving in an imperfect way. So kids are vulnerable to catastrophizing, misattributing cause and effect, and in such a way that they become more prone to depression. Also, body changes that accompany puberty are very correlated with surges in depression, and in particularly gender differences. Early puberty girls are more vulnerable to depression as a consequence of those pubertal changes. And again, the pubertal depression chain may be less salient, frankly, for African American girls. All right, and finally, one more thing about girls, sort of that kind of relational aggression that girls are more exposed to, harassment, teasing, bullying, rejection, those kind of relational aggression is just that kind of negative emotional feedback, which increases their vulnerability to depression. So some adolescents are more cognitively vulnerable to depression by virtue of negative cognitive styles. So they take a controllable event that may be dependent on their behavior, attach a negative attribution to that, make a decision based on that increases the likelihood that that is going to be repeated over time. For example, people ignore me because of the way I look. I need to stay on the sidelines. I then have fewer interpersonal interactions, which creates a cycle that creates a vulnerability to depression. And a mother's depressive history is also correlated with depression in children, particularly female children. Modeling and inferential feedback about the causes and effects of negative life events contribute to the child's risk for depression. I had a client where depression was generational, and the scripts and schemas that were handed down from generation to generation were remarkable. Basically, life is bad things happen, I have no control, people are not supportive, and those all reinforce negative attributions that lead to depression. Okay, and it can be very generational. And again, interventions designed to teach more adaptive ways to interpret negative events can short circuit the early onset of depression in adolescence. Okay, moving on. Substance abuse. Okay. The vast majority of adolescents begin their initiation of substance use in adolescence. Drugs of abuse, however, have a very differential effect on the adolescent brain than it has on the adult brain. That's why sort of generally the notion is to delay onset as long as possible because of the vulnerability of the brain to those substances, the young adolescent brain is to those substances. But those developmental brain changes that tilt toward impulsivity, seeking reward and taking risk contribute to higher risk for substance use. And that's very normal. Normal adolescent development tilts in those ways, tilts toward brain changes in impulsivity, reward, and risk-taking. Those are sort of the emotional reward systems that are very at work in early adolescence. And so that's normal. But when you talk about impaired brain development, that can also lead to substance abuse. So when you have impaired cognitive development, what you find is that emotional control system is dominant over cognitive control processes, which in healthy, normal adolescent development can eventually override the emotional control systems. So an impaired brain development can be both caused by substance abuse and can lead to substance abuse as well. And the research suggests that externalizing kids may have a different pathway towards substance use and abuse than internalizing kids. They have different vulnerabilities. For example, for externalizers, it's the activation of that reward cue system in the brain that contributes to their vulnerability. Sort of reward seeking, novelty seeking, and impulsivity contribute to their substance use. And the earlier the expression of that externalized behaviors, the worse the outcomes tend to be. But for internalizers, it appears that their sort of hyper-responsive fear-anxiety systems contribute to their vulnerability. And the calming effect of substances is reinforcing. So there's they tend to have different vulnerabilities with respect to the onset of substance abuse. And as you know, there's a substantial comorbidity between substance use and mood and disruptive behavior disorder. So there's a lot of comorbidity there. So when you talk about the transition from substance use to substance abuse or substance dependence or addiction, biogenetic factors are most crucial in that transition from use to dependence. The genes play a role in individual susceptibility to dependence once the person starts to experiment. And that may be considered a physiological vulnerability to addiction. Okay, so the progression to substance abuse disorders is more related, the progression to dependence and substance abuse disorders is more related to the age of initiation and the frequency of use. And social circumstances, while social circumstances facilitate initiation, it's those genetic factors that appear to play a role in continued use. All right. So just to sum, initiation is common. It's a common from a developmental perspective. Many kids initiate substance use during the adolescent period, but maintenance seems to be more due to genetic factors and more acute factors like major mental illness, temperament, and those sorts of things that affects the maintenance of substance use over time. Okay. So what we want to think about when we're doing these evaluations is the age of onset, what's the family history, what are some comorbid conditions, and what is the risk for the maintenance over time of substance use, substance misuse. Okay. Trauma and victimization. Juvenile justice youth tend to be a highly traumatized population. The lifetime rates of traumatic events range from 60% to over 90% for youth involved in the juvenile justice system. Traumatization is highly associated with mental health problems. Internalizing disorders, including depression and suicide, externalizing disorders, severe PTSD, and co-occurring disorders such as substance abuse. Exposure to multiple experiences of victimization is correlated with clinical severity. So the more exposure, the more likely it is to have more acute symptoms, particularly with respect to externalizing disorders. And interventions really need to be chosen with respect to their usefulness and utility with a traumatized juvenile population. So when you think about psychopathology and dispositional and competence and waiver evaluations, you want to ask yourself, how anxious is the juvenile? How emotionally laden is the information? What is the degree of comorbidity? Family toxicity, is the family likely to aggravate or mitigate interventions that are offered, and are the interventions appropriate? And again, this is sort of typical. The teenage mouse, I can totally get away with this. And there are some challenges with respect to evaluating risk. Developmental challenges. There's less of an established pattern of behavior. Adults have a long history from which we can use to ascertain the presence or absence of risk factors. Youth don't have that long history. There's a much less of an established pattern. Adolescent behavior is more governed by context than by character and characterological issues. Risk prediction in the adolescent period should be short-term. At best, it can predict the next developmental period versus long-term outcomes. And you should always consider sort of the normative quality of the behavior in question. For example, substance use. If you have a 13-year-old who's drinking heavily at the age of 13, that's a different picture risk-wise than a 17-year-old who's drinking, unless the age of onset was 12. But so you have to take in the salience of different developmental periods with respect to the calculating the risk of certain behaviors. There's a saying in risk assessment that as prevalence decreases, persistence increases. So the more unusual something is, the earlier the onset, the more risk, the higher risk it places that kid, the higher risk category. So if something is rare, not prevalent, and you're seeing it at an earlier age, the more likely it is that it's going to persist over time. Okay, so with respect to risk, I want you to think about risk is not really something, all kids take risks, or it's, there's a feeling of invulnerability. It's really about social and emotional factors. Specifically, it's about reward magnitude. How big is the reward I'm likely to get by engaging in this risky behavior? And what is my social environment telling me about the consequences? And adolescents are more inclined to take risks in order to gain reward, and they're more likely still to do that in the presence of their peers. Okay. Not all adolescents engage in risky behaviors in the forms of dangerous kinds of risk-taking behaviors. Factors such as, maturational timing, opportunity, temperament can amplify or attenuate the likelihood that they're going to engage in risky and dangerous kinds of behaviors. Oops, sorry. And as the cognitive control system improves over time, the more it is likely that a youth will be able to prioritize better decision-making with respect to better evaluations with respect to risk. Risk-taking tails off as the developmental period progresses, particularly in healthy adolescents. And now I want to talk a little bit about sort of the subcategory, which is impulsivity. There was an interesting article, I encourage you to read it, where the authors broke down impulsivity into kind of 3 component parts that are not, they're more or less present in individual kids. One is the notion of acting without thinking. Acting without thinking might include something like hyperactivity without any evidence of deliberation. We've all seen a lot of kids who are, who act without thinking. And that is typically associated with executive functioning deficits. Impatience, on the other hand, is difficulty inhibiting a short-term reward in service to a delayed reward. So this may be more connected to working memory problems, and that I can't delay what I want in the moment in service to a longer-term goal. And lastly, sensation seeking is the exploration of novel stimuli despite knowing that there are risks associated with that. And so when you think about decision-making in adolescence, the more favorable the affect associated with a choice, the less risk is thought to attach to it. So, if the reward is great, the risk is going to be perceived as much, much lower. So affect-driven choices rely much less on deliberation and those sort of cognitive processes involved in deliberation. All right. Amenability, this is a big part of things like waiver and transfer evaluations. So what you want to look at with respect to amenability is, certain characteristics of the juvenile. Does the juvenile have some anxiety and discomfort, remorse, unhappiness about the situation that they're in? That is something really to work on with respect to interventions. So a youth is considered more amenable if they have some of that discomfort and anxiety. Can they make adult attachments? What's the chronicity of their behaviors? Have these behaviors been occurring for a long time, or are they more recent? And then, how impulsive is the juvenile? How might that impact their ability to engage in treatment, to self-reflect, to think about thinking, that sort of thing. Are they able to engage in those kinds of things that are required certainly by treatment as usual, without adaptations? And then motivation for treatment. So you have to sort of examine what can improve the motivation for treatment, consider ways to enhance motivation, engage the adolescent in designing what they want from treatment, for example, as a way to improve motivation. Okay. And the other thing you want to think about are, when you think about risk, you have to view the behavior in question in their social context. For example, was the youth with peers, or did the behavior happen alone? Was the youth a leader or a follower? If there was violence attached to the incident, was it reactive or more instrumental violence? Is the juvenile responsive to punishment or supervision? What's been the response to previous interventions? You want to look at all those kinds of contexts. And then what is the likelihood of change? And particularly considering familial and social context. Is the family supportive of change, or will the family be an impediment to change? And are there available interventions designed to address the particular developmental stage and the needs of the juvenile? Do the interventions fit the developmental level of the juvenile? Are the staff understanding and trained in adolescent development? And I encourage you to be very specific with respect to interventions regarding these kinds of things. If, instead of recommending a multi-systemic family therapy, for example, you might break that down into its component parts and emphasize ways to make it be a better fit with the developmental level of the juvenile in question. Okay, interventions. Interventions need to be looked at in a developmental context as well. It can help you really increase your vigilance. Your understanding of adolescent development can really help you to increase your vigilance in clinical interviews. So what you want to do is you want to ask questions like, to elicit, how do they view cause and effect? What did you do? What did others do? How did that make you feel? What decisions do they regret? What was their last best decision? How did you make that decision? What were the steps you took to make that decision? And so it can help you to glean what their thinking was at the time, what's impaired, and what needs to be addressed to reduce their risk over time. And it also, understanding development can also help you to prioritize and to place into context issues for therapeutic intervention. Do they need work on sort of, better managing their anxiety? Do they need work on how to make better decisions? Do they need work on what's sort of, what kind of decisions they need to make to assist their attorney, those kinds of things. And it also helps you to understand what's normative and what's non-normative. Again, I did an evaluation of a 16-year-old who was his first offense. He was involved with both antisocial and pro-social peers, but he had a very supportive family. And even though the behavior in question was concerning and there needed to be consequences, I considered him a relatively low-risk kid. So I didn't want to make a lot of recommendations around high dosage, high duration interventions that were designed for high-risk kids. I wanted to leave him in an environment that was already supportive of him and making, with some recommendations for therapeutic interventions, but it really helps us to select interventions and select dosage and duration based on what's developmentally normative in context, and also interventions for older adolescents versus younger adolescents. I am running out of time here a little bit, so I'm going to move into the thing I want to say about CBT is that CBT is very, as I said earlier, has a very high cognitive component. It requires youth to be able to recognize and differentiate emotions. It requires metacognitive skills, thinking about thinking. It involves social perspective taking. And so for many young adolescents, CBT has, too high a cognitive demand. And so you want to think about developmental adaptations, making the language more concrete, taking things more slowly, doing more very concrete role playing, and just, like I said, taking things more slowly, adjusting the tempo. So when you think about CBT for adolescents, there is empirically validated CBT, for example, for African-American adolescents and the like, but I want you to think about what the developmental level is for your adolescent that you're evaluating, and is the demand too high? All right, cultural considerations. In the clinical interview, there are several steps to consider, several questions to ask yourself as you're going through an evaluation on a kid who's from a culture that's different from your own. Being foreign-born, for example, predicts internalizing problems in adolescence, and acculturation stress can really lead to depression and anxiety. And while all that is complicated enough, you want to keep in mind some core components to think about as you proceed through these evaluations. In the clinical interview, for example, do you shake hands or not? What is informed consent? Do they understand concepts like confidentiality? How do you interpret nonverbal behaviors or eye contact, facial expressivity, those kinds of things, because those can have very different meanings from culture to culture. Whether or not to use an interpreter. Preferably with respect to interpreters, they shouldn't be family members. You want to avoid colloquial expressions. You want to express one idea at a time. Be sure to speak to the client and not the interpreter. And then query afterward about communication difficulties. So you want to keep those kinds of things in mind. And with respect to diagnoses, you want to think about what is the cultural identity of your client? How is mental illness conceptualized in that culture? What is the degree of stigma associated with mental illness? What do the client and their family think caused the problems that they're having right now? And how has that problem affected the client? What help has been sought? Are there community members that can be utilized in terms of recommending interventions? And how is the relationship with the clinician perceived? Is it perceived as one of equality or one of deference? And understand that there are cultural problems, as you all know, within the DSM. The DSM sees the self as very individualistic, and mental illness largely resides within the individual rather than in the external world or the spirit world. Disorders are very discrete, and that mental disorders are largely universal. And so there are real cultural problems with the DSM. Okay. Other cultural considerations to take into account. So with respect to the youth, you want to consider the age of the youth, the national origin, the race, the ethnicity. You want to know, is the youth more acculturated than their parents? I've often seen that youth that I evaluate from different cultures speak English far, far better than their parents do. And it puts them in a very, there's a real power differential when the youth is interpreting the world essentially to their parents. What's the gender of the youth, the sexual orientation, religion, disability, socioeconomic status. With respect to the family, how long are they fully acculturated? What's their linguistic capacity? Is there trauma? If they're immigrants, both pre and post immigration, is there a kinship network that can be used? And intervention should reflect how expressions of distress are manifested. And so particular care should be used in diagnosis and treatment recommendations. And certainly evidence-based interventions are best. And recognize that barriers to interventions exist: finances, health insurance, transportation, lack of linguistic support, stigma, etc. And recognize also that minority cultures are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, from patrolling neighborhoods, arrests, detentions, dispositions, and transfers. Minority youth are overrepresented, and we certainly don't want to perpetuate that. And finally, evaluating the science. There's a few things I want to say about evaluating science on adolescent development and adolescent brain development in particular. When someone says things are hardwired, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. Basically, there's very little that's hardwired in adolescence. You know, adolescence is a time of opportunity and change, and what's going on, the developmental changes that are going on in the brain are very, very influenced by the environment. And there's much to be made, much is often made of imagery in the brain science research. And while we can generate very interesting images, they don't say anything about motivation or intention. They're a snapshot in time that is under laboratory or medical conditions, such that the influences of the social environment are unaccounted for. So while they're interesting, they're not kind of ready for prime time with respect to the legal system. Brain science, for the most part, talks about correlations, not causations. It's yet to be determined to what extent brain developmental milestones cause changes in behavior. There's no expert consensus on what anatomical brain science means in terms of violent behavior in juveniles, and it's certainly not ready for the legal system. But what it is ready for, well, before I get to that, what I will say is that there are a lot of within group differences with respect to adolescent development, probably more so than between group differences. Yes, adolescents are different than adults, but certainly as adolescents progress, they become closer and closer to having the capabilities of adults. But there are a lot of within group differences, and I have been very humbled in my work with adolescents in making assumptions about what a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old can do, and then sort of being surprised in my evaluation. So it's important to keep an open mind. It's important to allow ourselves to be humbled by the kid in front of us, because there's a lot of group data out there. All the research is done on adolescents as a group. But when we extrapolate down to our individual adolescent that we're seeing in the moment, there's a lot of variability. all adolescents have juvenile brains, but not all adolescents engage in delinquency. So, why is that? We need to ask ourselves, why is that? It's not just that they have an adolescent, an immature brain does not explain everything. And most adolescents, while delinquency is very common in adolescents, severe violent reoffending is not a high base rate behavior. And so what that tells us is that adolescents over time can learn to control their impulses, and most do. Some don't, and those are sometimes the ones that we see, but that is not common, certainly common to all adolescents. Okay, so it's very important to sort of think about, use the data to inform the questions that we ask, but then look at our individual kid and kind of see how more or less they comport with what the data tells us about what the developmental period is. So what really works for the science and what has really shown remarkable promise with respect to the adolescent brain research is on science and social policy. This is my last slide, Julie. So basically there have been a lot of reforms based on the science. Reforms with respect to status offenses, juvenile justice system jurisdiction, transfer to adult court, access to counsel. Many states have developed juvenile specific juvenile competence statutes that comport with the literature on how young adolescents think versus older adolescents think. Even things such as courtroom shackling, solitary confinement, the preservation of juvenile records has all been influenced by the adolescent development research. And so I know I sped through this, and I know I can be a little sort of tongue-tied when I'm trying to go through all this material very quickly, but I'm available to answer questions at the end, but I also want you to have my contact information. Please don't hesitate to contact me, to email me. That's my work cell phone. Please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions. And I just thank you very much. And I'll look at the Q&A. I know you're free to go, but I'll just see. We got about 10 questions here in the Q&A.
Just real quick, everybody, we did post the link for the CEU survey. So please make sure you fill that out, and remember, print it, take a screenshot, whatever you need to do. We don't send them to, we don't email them out. So make sure you save a copy for yourself. Dr. Baeder, yeah, please take the questions. That was such a fantastic talk and so much information in an hour. I feel like we can talk forever about this. And
yes,
a lot of messages, emails, text messages, comments that the participants really, really enjoyed it. So I'll let you take the questions now.
All right, thank you. So first question, what do you think about trying children as adults? I've seen 12-year-olds tried as adults, and I'm very concerned by the trend. Is there an absolute age that we could feel confident that the child could progress efficiently enough? Well, I agree with you. I'm very concerned. I would always be concerned about trying a 12-year-old as an adult. The trend has been, in terms of transfer and waiver, transfer to adult court, is to do them by a process called judicial discretion, which means taking an individualized look at the adolescent in question. What's the risk? How amenable is the juvenile? And what's the time left in the juvenile justice system? And is that enough time in order to mitigate the risks that are present? So certainly I would be hard pressed to ever believe, first of all, that a 12-year-old might be competent, first of all, to be tried as, competent to proceed in an adult system, because at that point they would have to be as competent as adults. There's no sort of juvenile standard in adult court. So that would be my first question. And secondly, typically the trajectory is that as an adolescent ages, beyond the age of 16, the more they comport with adult defendants. And depending on the risk posed and the shorter the time that's left in the juvenile justice system to address those risks, the more likely that a judge might find that there's enough evidence to try them as, transfer them to adult court. But I would be hard pressed. This whole Slender Man case was an example of very young adolescents who both were tried as adults, if I have a correct understanding of that. And I am very uncomfortable with that myself. And some states have these different mechanisms by which you can transfer a child into the adult system that are more automatic, but more and more states are reversing those and going back to sort of solely a judicial discretion format, so that at least an individual look can be taken each and every time. So the second question, do you think the competency threshold for juveniles in juvenile court should be different than the competency threshold for adults in criminal court? Threshold is a difficult question. I think that the dusky prongs, factual understanding, rational understanding, and ability to assist, apply for both adult court and in juvenile court. But I think the allowable impediments to competence should be different in juvenile court. And the juvenile competence evaluations that I do are much more complicated, much more complex, much more developmentally rooted than are the ones that I do, which are not pro forma, but they're much more standard in adult court. And so many jurisdictions are allowing certainly mental illness and cognitive deficits to be allowable impediments to competence, but many jurisdictions are allowing just developmental immaturity, just young age is an impediment to competence. And so their ability to understand the facts of the court, their ability to apply very abstract concepts to appreciating their legal situation, and their ability to communicate often very emotionally laden information to their attorneys to sort of satisfy that prong, it's a very high bar. So I do believe it's sort of the dusky standard holds, but how you apply it is very different in juvenile evaluations, competence evaluations, than in adult competence evaluations. You talked about accommodations for younger adolescents compared to older adolescents and helping them understand and participate in court proceedings. I'm just going to scroll down. Can you speak to what you would recommend as to what some of those accommodations would look like? The younger the adolescent, the more information needs to be placed in as concrete a terms as possible. I once asked a kid who was about 13, and I knew he had been to court for some initial hearings prior to seeing me for the evaluation. I said, so how did you find court? And he said, well, we took a left on Main Street, then a right on C. And I'm like, that's like the perfect example of a very concrete way to think about things. So things need to be phrased in a way that a young adolescent can understand. Usually they need more time to talk to their attorney and to have their attorney explain things. And to the extent that their attorneys are good at that, that should be an accommodation. But many young adolescents, even with all the accommodations in the world, are not going to meet that competence bar, just because developmentally they're incapable. The juvenile justice system, not to mention the adult system, but the juvenile justice system is a very, it relies very heavily on verbal skills, the ability to, think about multiple aspects of a problem, to kind of defer immediate reward in service to long-term interests. And that is just something that a lot of kids can't do. By arousal response, are you indicating hardiness found in cardiac behavioral medicine literature? Well, I don't know if I'm referring to hardiness, but I am talking about sort of the arousal that the autonomic response system comes up, it's that sort of heightened heart rate. So I suppose that maybe is hardiness, and sort of faster respiration, more stress, more anxiety. That's the arousal response that can come from any kind of stressor in the environment. I assume psychopathology as an effect of chronic early stress refers to internalized distress, e.g. anxiety, depression, not psychopathic development. Yes, psychopathology is very distinct. I meant that as a very distinct construct than psychopathy. I know there's a lot in the adolescent literature around callous and unemotional traits as sort of essentially a fledgling psychopathic phenomenon, but that's very, very different from psychopathology. And there's a lot of, that would take a whole other workshop to talk about psychopathy in adolescence and how to think about that. So yes, I'm talking about that. It's very distinct. It can be externalized. Psychopathology is still externalized. All that kind of aggression as a symptom of mental illness, and all those sort of hypervigilance associated with PTSD are externalized symptoms of psychopathology, very distinct from psychopathy. How much of early onset depression can be attributed to epigenetics versus environmental factors as mentioned, such as in repeated negative phrasing from familial figures? I think that it's very, it's sort of both and, but certainly when I talked about maternal depression as influencing the depression in children, particularly female children, it's really about that kind of modeling and inferences that are made about interactions, social interactions, and the degree of support in the environment and that sort of thing. So it's very much, sort of has that sort of repeated modeling, repeated inferences being made about cause and effect that can influence depression. What do I think of the work of August Eichhorn, The Wayward Youth, done with juvenile delinquents some time ago? And how do you treat young offenders who may have antisocial personality disorder with little deference to the juvenile justice system? Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with August Eichhorn's work. Perhaps I should be. I will make a note of that. But certainly adolescents that are with a higher degree of callous and unemotional traits. There's no antisocial personality disorder per se in children under the age of 18, but conduct disorder, callous and unemotional traits, all those kinds of things. Little sensitivity to punishment, sort of low emotional reactivity. Those are generally juveniles who need interventions of a higher dosage and a higher duration. There's a lot of good work. Look at the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Facility. That's a really good example of a very a reasonably successful program with kids who are very high in those kind of traits. So I would never say that nothing works, but it is something to very much pay attention to. And so I'll say that much. How would I suggest going about assessing or better understanding their development when court order directly states parameters that cannot discuss the offense? Well, there's a lot we can assess for without directly discussing the offense. We can we can glean how they make decisions about all kinds of things in their lives, their interactions with peers, their interactions with their family, how they do in school. And there are many, many ways that you can target the interview questions to glean sort of just generally at what developmental stage the juvenile is at, without directly addressing the parameters of the current offense. I know in many bindover evaluations, the difficulty is that sort of amenability and remorse and those kinds of things are considered very salient features. And some attorneys will say, we're not going to discuss the event in question. So you have to extrapolate from other data, whether they're earlier offenses that have already been disposed, or just sort of how they're doing in school, what was the age of onset, what kind of comorbid conditions are there, how do they make decisions, those kinds of things. How do you use CBT with kids that are resistant to, I'm not sure what the rest of that question is, but improving motivation to treatment is really about engaging, it's sort of a pre-process. It's almost like they're at a pre-contemplative stage of engaging in treatment. And so you really want to, try to engage them in what's going on in their life, what would they like to see change in their lives, those kinds of things. As a preparatory step to engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy. And like I said, the first thing you want to evaluate with respect to CBT is, does the child in question have the cognitive competence to be able to engage in unaccommodated CBT, if you will? I mean, there are ways to make CBT a little more concrete and a little more sort of slowed down and broken into its component parts, but you know, CBT as sort of as treatment as usual has a high cognitive component associated with it. Very great. I only evaluate 16 years old and older. The differences between a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old is something to consider during an evaluation. I couldn't agree more. It's like they're different in so many more ways, and it's very, very important to consider the differences between 16-year-olds that you typically evaluate and a 12-year-old. And I have, like I said, I have been humbled on a number of occasions. Is it possible to get a reference list? I sent a reference list to Julie, so I think she has the reference list. Yes, Julie, for the entire thing.
Yep, and we'll make sure we send that out with the PowerPoint and the recording.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
How do I respond to, so do you want me to, what do you want me to do, Julie? You want me to keep going, or?
We still have 230 people on, and as long as you have the time and people are willing to stay, go for it.
All right, you just get the hook when you want to get the hook, okay? And I'll keep going through here.
I'm gonna have to jump off in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
I believe Rachel and Anthony usually do around that time, so maybe 10 more minutes.
All right, very good.
Cool.
How do I respond to critiques, e.g. Justice Scalia, that point to data suggesting that adolescents have the emotional and cognitive maturity to make decisions regarding important decisions such as abortion, even voting, but are not mature enough to be tried as adults? I mean, that's really a red herring, because juveniles can make decisions when they're supported and they have supervision and, and there aren't in the presence of peers. And so decisions that aren't, I mean, not to say that abortion is not an emotionally laden decision, but if they, and the caliber of their decision-making around those kinds of decisions is affected by the degree to which they have support and supervision in those decisions. But those are very different decisions than are decisions that are in the spur of their moment, that may be impacted by substance use at the time of their involvement with their peers to engage in dangerous and delinquent behavior. And so that is one, I guess that's one thing, but you're asking they're not mature enough to be tried as adults. A 13-year-old can get pregnant, but the 13-year-old having the ability to make decisions that are required in adult court are two entirely different things. And a 13-year-old, any decision about abortion, for example, in a pregnancy of a 13-year-old, just as an example, with support and supervision, even that's a very difficult decision, but it's a very different decision with someone who has to present themselves in adult court, face adult sanctions that are decades and potentially decades and decades long. And so I just think that they're very, very different. It's apples and oranges. And I think that Justice Scalia's point was provocative, but I think it's really apples and oranges. Just an FYI, our Utah statutes have competence for juveniles, as does our Maine. I think the last time I checked, which was a while ago, about 30 states had specific juvenile competence statutes. I mean, some states just said, yes, juveniles have a right to be competent, see the adult statute. But about 30 states have developed very juvenile specific statutes. And I know in Maine, our statute, developmental immaturity is an allowable impediment to competence, which I think is huge. All right, you sort of answered this, but are there any juvenile assessment instruments? I agree that competence is competence and the cognitive components have to be the same. What about using an adult competence assessments with a juvenile to highlight the difference? I would not do that. I think you're going to be subject to a Dauber challenge, but I would use the JACI, the Juvenile Adjudicative Competence Instrument. It's by Tom Grisso. It's not a instrument per se, it's kind of a structured interview, but it has a lot of supporting data and it's really, really good. So that's what I would use. Some people have suggested like using the CAST MR, and I would not use that either. The MCAT, the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for Criminal Adjudication, has some data about how juveniles tend to perform in that. So that probably would survive a Dauber challenge as long as you put it in context, but I think the Jackie is the way to go. Antoinette, what are your thoughts about how remorse shows up differently as a function of things like SES or ethnicity? I think that's probably a very, very compelling question. You know, especially when you overlay development with SES and ethnicity, then it becomes a more complicated picture. I'm trying to think if I have something very specific to say about that, but I do think it's very important to highlight in evaluations, because what we don't want to do is sort of in any way imply that a quote unquote lack of remorse that's really developmentally rooted is somehow a characterological issue. And I do think that the sort of bad versus mad thing plays out more disproportionately with youth of color. They're more likely to be ascribed characterological failings versus sort of something that is either developmentally normative or more of a state issue, be hanging out with peers, that sort of thing. So I wish I had more to say about that, but that's kind of how I think it's very important to consider. All right, this is on the periphery of what you have discussed, but do you think willpower is very important in ending drug addiction? I think much is made out of willpower. And I think willpower, if you try to break that down into what that really is probably fairly developmental in nature. The ability to kind of exercise cognitive competence and override sort of the emotion is sort of, I would suggest, as an element of willpower, and that changes over time. But there's much, much more to it with respect to sort of the, biogenetic factors that are at work that make, willpower only one small component, I suppose, is what I'll say. It's not an irrelevant component if you really kind of break it down into what it really means, but it's only one small component. At least that's what I would say. Would she be willing to do a second webinar that focuses on more the advanced and nuanced issues regarding juveniles? I would love to see it. Well, Brittany, that's very kind of you. I feel like I've been, less than, wonderfully articulate during this particular one, but I leave that to Julie, and I do, I have a lot to say about juveniles. Next time I'll try to pare it down so I'm not spitting it out quite so fast, but thank you.
We would love to have you back so you and I can talk about that maybe in a month or two, get you on the calendar for.
All right. Well, that's very kind. People are so kind. Good God. Need the references on the structured interview mentioned to assess competence and other instruments, please. Jackie, Julie, if the Jackie is not in my material, the juvenile adjudicative competence instrument by Grisso, please let me know and I can get you that reference very easily. It's replete, and particularly my risk assessment and my competence workshops. So it would be very helpful to be able to watch this again. Yes, I imagine that's probably true. And if you put it on slower speed, it might be even more helpful still. But anyway, yes, I think I've got to them all.
Looks like you did. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, that was fast and too much information too fast. I apologize to whoever did the sign language interpretation on this. This must have been a nightmare, but anyway, thank you all, and thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Baeder. We'll talk soon. Have a great day, and everybody, we'll see you all next week. Hopefully you got that CU link. If not, we're going to give you about 60 more seconds before we sign off. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks, Ephraim.
Ephraim, thank you. Sorry if it was too crazy for you. Man, I talk a mile a minute. I know that.
Not a problem.
Okay.
Okay, and if anybody needs the link and you weren't able to access it on the chat, you can go ahead and send us an email and we'll get you what you need. Thanks so much. Okay, bye everybody. Thanks, Efrain. Have a great day.